Welcome to Houstonic.live, Series 280, which is the book Germs by Judith Miller, Engelhardt, and William Broad, which was published, made available for sale September 7th, 9th, year 2001. In this series, we are capturing the Amazon audiobook that you can see here. And what we have learned to review is that a big chunk of the Amazon audiobook is missing, was not narrated. So what we are doing here in this series is we have one episode in this 280 series per chapter, and this is episode 280.7, which is going to correspond to page 242 and the PDF for the book, which is chapter 7, titled Evil Empire. As the audiobook is missing narration, I'll be popping in and then popping back out to read the sections which are missing. And as usually the case, what they chose not to narrate is extremely revealing. So far, for example, the references to Philip Zelikow, the man who just not long after this particular event went on to become the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, those mentions were actually omitted from the Amazon audiobook. And that is why it is so important to do the history research. And the history research includes sometimes just looking at one piece of evidence and how it changes and morphs over time, because things do change. The book, as it was captured on September 7th, 9th, 2001, is almost not even really the same book that you can enjoy right now on Amazon Audible. Chapter 7 of the book, Evil Empire, starts on page 242.
Evil Empire.
Busy here. So I found chapter 4 of the audiobook starting at minute 20 and 54. Some audio which corresponds to chapter 7. I don't know. If American officials were worried about Shariko and other terrorists in the mid-1990s, they were obsessed with Russia. The debriefings of defectors like Pechenik and Alibek and Moscow's admissions about Sverdlovsk were disturbing enough. But not until Americans actually visited the premier Soviet germ factory did Washington fully grasp the enormity of what the Soviet Union had done.
In 1995, Andy Weber was a young diplomat who was first secretary at the American Embassy in Kazakhstan, a newly independent republic that had broken away from Moscow in 1991. Weber was one of the first Americans to grasp the full extent of the Soviet biological weapons program. In June 1995, he led the first American mission to Stepnogorsk, the most advanced Soviet germ warfare production plant and the only one outside the Russian heartland. The Scientific Experimental and Production Base, as Stepnogorsk was formerly known, was built in 1982 to develop and manufacture a new, more lethal variant of anthrax. The factory offered Washington its first look at the inner workings of the Soviet Union's germ empire.
Stepnogorsk was listed on no map. Its address was a post office box, number 2076. The remote site was only whispered about, almost reverentially, by military strategists in Moscow over 1,000 miles away. But by mid-1995, when Andrew Weber's small team of Americans was permitted to visit the plant, the Soviet Union was no more, and the germ complex of Stepnogorsk was a decaying wreck. Standing inside Building 221, the main production site, Andy Weber stared at the 10 20-ton fermentation vats that towered 4 stories above him like a row of Midwestern grain silos. Each vessel could hold 20,000 liters of fluid. Together, they filled a building 2 football fields long. Weber had read the intelligence reports about the mysterious facility before his trip. In the 1980s, the analysts had correctly deduced from the configuration of more than 50 buildings that the complex had been designed to produce anthrax or some other bacteriological agent. They had also accurately described the facility as large, even by Soviet standards, where Bolshoi or big was invariably a compliment. But until the arrival in the West of the 2 Soviet defectors, spy agencies had little idea what kind of research was being conducted at Stepnogorsk, what weapons the plant was making, or how serious a threat it posed. Even the intelligence reports filed after the Soviet defections failed to convey the scale of the operation. Weber quickly did the math. The vessels working at full capacity could brew 300 tons of anthrax spores of a production cycle of 220 days, enough to fill many ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles. Iraq's entire production could just about fit into a single one of these gigantic vats. Since 100 grams of dried anthrax was theoretically enough to wipe out a small city, the product of this plant alone was more than enough to have killed America's entire population. And the Stepnogorsk complex was only one of at least 6 Soviet production facilities. Weber shuddered at the kill ratio. Destructive capacity on this scale was unimaginable to most Americans, even to him, who had few illusions about the Soviets.
The following video clip is from the PBS Nova documentary on bioterrorism, obviously made during the year 2000 and 2001, which was scheduled for initial release in November of 2001, and of course was meant to accompany and or complement this book.
The reporters found no evidence that the U.S. ever used biological weapons in Cuba or anywhere else. There is no conclusive evidence that the Soviet Union ever used their biological weapons either. But the weapons they had ready to use were more advanced than anything the Americans developed.
The Soviet Union, exploiting the revolution in genetic engineering and molecular biology that happened in the 1970s and 1980s, went 10, 20, 30 years beyond what we ever achieved in the sophistication and lethality and variety of biological weapons.
In laboratories like this one, VEKTOR in Siberia, Soviet scientists were able to use modern biotechnology to combine traits from several organisms into one, even to create entirely new diseases unknown to nature.
Scientists had long struggled to overcome disease. Yet here at Stepnogorsk, the Soviet Union had spent billions of dollars mobilizing disease for war. It had devoted some of its best brains, virtually unlimited resources, and Russian science itself to the mass production of epidemics, a strategy as chilling as it was perverse. Stepnogorsk was a standby production facility on orders to produce mass quantities of germs in the event of an international crisis. Disease by the ton was its industry. Pechenik and Alibek had already described the vast germ warfare empire to Western intelligence analysts. American satellites had long focused on what were believed to be germ laboratories, production and testing facilities run by the 15th Directorate of the Soviet Ministry of Defense.
Stepnogorsk was an integral part of Biopreparat, the laboratories and plants that supposedly manufactured vaccines and other civilian pharmaceutical products. Known to the Soviets as the Concern, Biopreparat was in fact a hub of Moscow's germ effort, a vast network of secret cities, production plants, and centers that studied and perfected germs as weapons. This vast Soviet infrastructure had been created in 1973, when the ink on the treaty banning germ weapons was barely dry. At its peak in the late 1980s, Biopreparat employed more than 30,000 people, about half of the 60,000 Soviets engaged in biowarfare at more than 100 facilities throughout the Soviet Union. Secretly run by the military with an annual budget of close to $1 billion, the biological weapons program had stockpiled plague, smallpox, anthrax, and other agents for the intercontinental ballistic missiles and bombers aimed at New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, and other American cities. The Concern had studied some 80 agents and prepared a dozen or more for war. Almost every Soviet ministry, from the Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Health, and including even the notorious secret police, had contributed to the germ warfare program. The United States may have had a military-industrial complex, but the Soviet Union was a military-industrial complex. Standing inside Building 221, the main production site, Weber stared at the 10, 20-ton fermentation vats that towered 4 stories above him like a row of Midwestern grain silos. Each vessel could hold 20,000 liters of fluid. Together, they filled a building 2 football fields long. Weber was given to understatement, but for him the only word to describe what he was seeing was evil, pure evil. And the United States was doing virtually nothing about it.
Andrew Weber promised himself that day that if he did nothing else in government, he would try to understand what had happened at this plant and at dozens of other germ warfare labs, institutes, and production centers. What had the Soviets produced here? What had happened to the product, the Soviets' anodine term for their germ stockpiles? And where were the hundreds of scientists and technicians who had once worked here? At its peak, this complex had employed 700 scientists and senior technicians. Now there were 180. Where were the others? Had they taken their deadly expertise to Iran, Iraq, or other rogue states eager to recruit them? Were they driving taxis? Or working for terrorist groups? And what had the Soviets been thinking when they built these germ factories? How and when had they planned to use Stepnogorsk's product? There are few answers to such questions in 1995 as Andy Weber walked dumbfounded through the ruins of the secret facility. But he knew that hereafter he would strive to illuminate what the Russians call the white spots of their history, especially this grim chapter on the production of weapons of mass destruction. He would also try to ensure that Russia would finally, belatedly, adhere to the treaty banning germ weapons that it had signed in 1972 and then flagrantly violated for the next 20 years. If he did nothing else in his life, he told himself, he would do this. At first glance, Andy Weber seemed an unlikely missionary. Polite and soft-spoken, he rarely raised his voice. At the Pentagon, he was known for his long silences and unflappable disposition. His calm, pale face and gray eyes revealed none of the emotions that consumed him. The awe, fear, disgust, and obsessive curiosity he felt about the Soviet Union's most shameful and still secret military program. Weber blended into almost any crowd. Slender and of average height, he looked older than his 35 years. With a receding hairline and the shapeless dark blue or gray suits, white shirts, and plain colored ties he usually wore, the costume of the diplomatic corps he had joined right out of Georgetown University's Graduate School of Foreign Service. But this bland demeanor masked a passion for living on the edge. And he was a keen observer, a fluent writer, and a rigorous editor, talents that were evident in the cables he filed to Washington from his first consular post in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia during the 1991 Gulf War and from the American embassy in Bonn. Weber came into his own in oil-blessed Kazakhstan, a former Soviet republic that was the largest and potentially the richest state in Central Asia. While serving at the embassy in the capital, then Almaty, between 1993 and 1995, he had skillfully managed political, military relations with a proud state that was still poor. Together with neighboring Uzbekistan, another even poorer former Soviet republic, Kazakhstan had renounced nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons soon after becoming independent in 1991. The post was thrilling for a diplomat fluent in Russian and in search of political adventure. A year after his arrival, Weber helped plan and carry out Operation Sapphire, in which, for less than $30 million, Washington secretly transferred more than 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, enough for more than 50 atomic bombs, from Kazakhstan to the United States for secure storage. Next came Operation Pivot Sail, in which he secretly negotiated the $40 million purchase of Moldova's 21 MiG-29 jet fighters, which could carry nuclear weapons and more than 500 air-to-air missiles. In another secret operation, this one codenamed Auburn Endeavor, he quietly helped remove nuclear material from Georgia, a volatile Caucasus state, at a cost of $4 million. Through such missions, Weber developed a reputation within the arms control bureaucracy for what was known in the jargon of non-proliferation as, quote, preemptive acquisition, unquote. Avoiding the diplomatic circuitry of Almaty, Weber had rented a traditional wooden house with a large fireplace and sauna in the snowy mountains outside the capital. There he served home-cooked dinners for Kazakh military officials and national security officials. Accompanied by his three-legged pit bull, Maggie. Just a thought of Andy Weber, in the little wooden cottage with the stew, hanging on a bar over the fire, and the little three-legged Maggie the dog, just while he's collecting enriched uranium. Accompanied by his three-legged pit bull, Maggie, Weber and his Kazakh friends fished in summer and skied in winter and hunted pheasant, moose, and elk in the thick snow that blanketed the rugged Tian Shan Mountains. It was on one such trip that a Kazakh official told Weber of his visit to the eerie city of germs and death in the remote northeastern part of Kazakhstan's Central Asian steppe. Would he like to visit Stepnogorsk and some of the other places where the Soviets had tested their most lethal weapons? Weber was more than eager, knowing all too well the failure of previous efforts to gain access to Soviet facilities. The 1992 Trilateral Pact between Britain, Russia, and the United States, which called for reciprocal visits and candid classified disclosures of all past germ warfare programs, had never panned out, at least not as far as London and Washington were concerned. American and British experts who had visited institutes known to have been deeply involved in the Soviet program were given limited access and repeatedly told lies, or, as the Soviet deceptions were known, legends. The research in communist times, the Russian officials insisted, was defensive, limited to vaccines and other antidotes. American and British experts made a curious discovery when they visited VEKTOR, the Siberian institute that Alabak had identified as the biggest, most sophisticated facility ever built to study and refine viruses for weapons. Russia had secretly moved its smallpox samples there from the Institute of Viral Preparations in Moscow, which the World Health Organization had designated as the only acceptable storage site in Russia. The move violated WHO regulations, which required the Russians to inform the international organization immediately of any change in the status of its smallpox repository. The Russians' tour of American facilities had also been a farce. The team insisted on visiting facilities owned by Pfizer twice. A member of the Russian team had been found wandering the halls of the company's lab far away from the designated tour, igniting suspicions that the Russians were using all these visits for commercial espionage. During a trip to the Pine Bluff Arsenal in Arkansas, the germ factory the United States had shut down in 1969, a Russian colonel had stopped the bus and demanded to inspect a tall structure on a hill. As the Americans watched with amusement, the colonel had climbed to the top of what turned out to be a water tower. Even Ken Alabak was shamed by the Russian team's conduct. He concluded that perhaps the Americans were not hiding an offensive program after all, a realization that helped prompt his decision to defect. Though the Russians had found no proof of an American biowarfare program during their tour, a Russian official later told Izvestia that the team had found that the United States was violating the treaty. The Americans were livid. Some officials concluded that the Russians were using their visit as a pretext to delay implementing Yeltsin's order to dismantle the program. The final breakdown of the 1992 agreement came in 1995, when Russia refused to allow Americans to visit labs controlled by the military, and both sides exchanged secret briefings on their previous germ warfare efforts. American and British officials found Moscow's account hopelessly incomplete, but the Clinton administration chose not to challenge the Russians over their lapses. There were other, more pressing issues in the United States-Russian relationship. The monitoring regime fell apart. American officials hoping to find out more about the Russian program would have to find another way. Weber knew that the opportunity to visit Stepnogorsk with his three-legged dog Maggie take samples from Stepnogorsk, and interview scientists who worked in what was now an independent country that had renounced unconventional weapons, would do more than help refute Russia's claims. It would provide invaluable information about the germ weapons that the Soviets had made and other critical data about the still largely secret program. It might also reveal whether Russia was continuing such illegal work, as many CIA and DIA analysts believed. Almost a year of intensive discussions ensued before Weber secured permission from President Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan to visit Stepnogorsk and several other facilities. Weber then sent word to the 4 American experts waiting in Frankfurt to accompany him. He knew that the Kazakh president, a charismatic autocrat and former member of the Soviet Politburo, had made a risky decision. Moscow would not be pleased when it learned that American scientists and intelligence officials had been visiting one of the former biological holy of holies. But Nazarbayev and other senior officials were furious about the environmental and public health disasters they had inherited from the Soviet Union. The Russians had used Kazakhstan and neighboring Uzbekistan not only to make and test the world's most advanced germ weapons, but also to develop nuclear and chemical weapons. The Soviets had conducted 465 nuclear tests on the flat steppe of Semipalatinsk in eastern Kazakhstan. 160 of them open-air tests that had poisoned the soil and air and left many Kazakhs with radiation-related cancers and debilitating diseases. At a facility in Pavlodar and at the Chemical Research Institute in Nukus, Uzbekistan, the Soviets had made, stored, and tested a staggering array of chemical weapons. In the midst of the shrinking Aral Sea, on Vazrajdinya Island, whose name means rebirth or renaissance, the Soviet Union had killed thousands of mice, hamsters, guinea pigs, monkeys, baboons, horses, mules, sheep, and other animals in open-air tests of their newest, most lethal germ weapons. It had also accidentally killed an estimated 30,000 saiga antelope on the Usturt Plateau in western Uzbekistan when, during one chemical weapons experiment, the winds unexpectedly shifted. As for the human inhabitants of this blighted region, no one seemed to know what had happened to them. Kazakh and Uzbek officials knew that the Russians had viewed their countries and people as expendable. But until the Russians left in the early 1990s, they had little idea of the magnitude of the ecological disasters confronting them. After the Kremlin's new management rejected their appeals to assess and repair the damage inflicted by the weapons programs, both countries quietly turned to Washington for help. The reception of Weber's team in Stepnogorsk was icy. An emissary from the production plant greeted the Americans as they emerged from their chartered Yak-40 jet at the Dirt Strip airport with a curt message. They were to leave the city immediately. Andrew Weber held his ground, insisting that Kazakhstan president had authorized the visit. But he had no documentation to prove it. After being escorted to a small guest house in town, Weber and his team waited anxiously for permission to proceed. An hour later, a short, well-built man, seemingly accustomed to giving orders, entered the room. Gennady L. Lepyoshkin, a former Soviet colonel who had run the germ plant since Ken Alibek's transfer to Moscow in late 1987, said, "Who's in charge here?" Weber identified himself, explaining that President Nazarbayev had invited his team to visit the plant. Trying to size up the mild-mannered young American who spoke such fluent Russian, Lepyoshkin declared that no one could enter Stepnogorsk, let alone his institute, without written authorization. "You are not welcome here," he said firmly. Weber said nothing but called the Kazakh capital. Several hours later, the fax authorizing the visit arrived. The next morning, the Americans traveled to Colonel Lepyoshkin's facility, some 20 minutes away from the city, where more testy encounters ensued. though Kazakh leaders had told their American colleagues about the Stepnogorsk complex's world and their desire either to close the facility or redirect it towards peaceful endeavors, Lepyoshkin and his colleagues stuck to their Soviet-era script. The plant had been built for wartime production of vaccines, they insisted. Ken Alabak, the defector, had lied. He was a traitor. Lepyoshkin said, "Let's not argue. I'll show you everything here, and you draw your own conclusions." Weber and his colleagues spent the next 2 days visiting every part of the enormous compound. What they saw horrified them. Everything Alabak had told the CIA was true. But even Alabak may not have recognized his former facility in its present state of decay. Weeds sprouted from cracked sidewalks that linked the complex's 25 main buildings. There were more potholes than roads. The wire security fences surrounding the compound were torn and no longer electrified. The motion sensors outside the complex were gone. Winter winds that rip across the Central Asian steppe had blown out windows in most of the main buildings. Rain, snow, and ice storms had eroded the gray concrete walls. Airlocks that had once kept deadly microbes from escaping now hung open. The plasticized lab floors were torn and buckled from neglect and the weather. Many buildings appeared to be abandoned. Still, remnants of the plant's deadly past were unmistakable. In the infamous Building 600, the American team found the room that had housed the 50-foot-high aerosol test chamber, the largest indoor testing facility the Soviets had ever built, in which Lepyoshkin's scientists had tried out their strains of anthrax, Marburg, Ebola, and other agents on animals. The walls were still crisscrossed with pipes that had delivered fresh, breathable air to the space suit-like garments worn by scientists who worked with the deadly germs. Unmistakable, too, were the grounding strips designed to prevent the buildup of static electricity, which could cause accidental explosions in rooms where germ bombs and bomblets were tested. Not to mention the glossy floors of epoxy to ease decontamination. The waste pipes that carried the contaminated water from the buildings were now dry and cracked, but there was no hiding their function. Weber and the other Americans saw remnants of lab equipment that had been used to manufacture anthrax. The now abandoned refrigerated vaults in which hundreds of tiny vials of freeze-dried bacteria had been stored on metal trays in neat rows. In labs that lined the long, half-lit corridors, they found tiny pipettes that scientists had used to draw the nutrient medium and anthrax seed stocks out of small vials and into larger ones. They counted the dozens of hot boxes, each about the size of a microwave oven, in which the brew had incubated before it was siphoned off into larger flasks, which were then taken to another room in Building 221, where air bubbling machines turned the liquid into a rich, coffee-colored slurry. The Americans roamed the underground bunkers, which had 7-foot-thick walls, and the rooms in which the finished product and raw materials had been stored. They photographed the facility from the top of giant mounds of earth intended to protect the agent during an aerial attack. They stood on the abandoned helicopter pad that had once received dignitaries from Moscow, and they toured the underground filling rooms in which anthrax had been filtered into warheads, cluster bombs, and other delivery systems. At night, the Americans returned to the rundown Institute guest house to compare notes, badly shaken by what they had seen. Though crumbling and impoverished, the complex remained a danger. The plant, its equipment, and its scientists could still make germ weapons. Somehow, the threat had to be reduced. There was little alternative work available in town. The desolate city, like the Institute, was decrepit, a ghost town with people. The weather was mild, but there were few people on the streets lined with rows of drab concrete apartment blocks or on the tree-lined walkways that connected one monotone block to another. The parks and playgrounds were also largely deserted. The movie theater and one hotel had been closed for years. Institute officials estimated that there were still about 40,000 people in Stepnogorsk, just over half the city's peak population of 70,000 in the mid-1980s. Many Russians who had abandoned Stepnogorsk for Russia or for wherever they could find work after the Soviet Union's collapse had been replaced by even more desperate souls from the countryside, where there was even less work, food, or shelter. The city still had a few remnants of its proud, if secretive, past, including a giant metal and brick monument erected in 1964 to commemorate the military-industrial city's founding. Though Stepnogorsk's ball-bearing plant, which made parts for trucks and tanks, now operated only part-time, the red-lettered slogan on its walls, "My factory, my pride," recalled better times for people who had seen their standard of living collapse in only a decade. The germ weapons plant had been built on land adjacent to a giant civilian biotechnological plant simply called Progress, which had once produced herbicides, animal feed supplements, and ethanol. Now its fermenters produced mainly vodka. People survived largely on the vegetables and potatoes they grew in summer, fish caught from the local river, and hope. Sergei Antonovich, a former germ weapons scientist who owned a poorly stocked pharmacy in town, told the Americans, quote, "Hope dies last," unquote. Hopelessness was perhaps the most difficult burden for the once envied enclave of scientists, technicians, and privileged workers. Stepnogorsk's giant sports stadium still stood. So did a large hospital, though it had no medicine, and a department store stocked with imported goods from Korea, Turkey, China, Russia, and even Italy. But with 50% unemployment, few residents could afford the costly goods. Most people shopped at the outdoor bazaar, where poorer Kazakhs sold their own clothing, buttons, homemade pickles, and Russian army watchers. It adds, Andrew Weber paid $12 for one with a week's guarantee, and it stopped after only 2 days. There were fur coats and hats, essential during the fierce winters, as well as lanterns for when the power inevitably failed, and gaudy Chinese bedroom slippers to wear on ice-cold floors, all at negotiable prices. On the last day of the visit, Lepyoshkin invited Weber and his team to the Institute's Riverside Dasha for a vodka and shish kebab farewell. Lepyoshkin brought his dog, a beige cocker spaniel named Chase, who howled along in tune whenever his master played guitar and sang Russian folk songs. Lepyoshkin told his guests the official program was over, filling their large glasses with vodka. Now they could speak honestly. As the vodka flowed in the sunset over the Seledi River, the official lies that Lepyoshkin and his colleagues had told the Americans were stripped away. Of course the plant never produced vaccines or any other product of possible benefit to mankind, Lepyoshkin eventually confided to the astonished Americans. He and his colleagues were only seeing whether they could still get away with old cover stories, what in Russian is known as hanging noodles on the ears of the Americans. With embarrassed pride tinged with what seemed like real remorse, he confided that Stepnogorsk had not only made and tested anthrax, but had also produced the world's most powerful strains of anthrax, which were resistant to heat and cold, and even variants that would defeat antibiotics. Stepnogorsk's pride was number 836, the most virulent of all. The strain had been developed by Ken Alabak himself, who had found a more efficient way to produce and disseminate a pathogen created by the Soviet Union's first anthrax factory, which was in Kirov. Alapikov anthrax, as it was known, needed fewer spores to be effective in an attack, and hence delivered more bang for the buck, as Alabak himself had put it. The strain was 3 times as lethal in both dry and liquid form as the anthrax that was produced at Sverdlovsk, Russia, the site of the devastating accidental leak in 1979. In fact, Lepyoshkin confirmed, the Stepnogorsk complex owed its existence to that accident. The Kazakh plant had been built to fill the potential production gap after the Soviets were forced to stop producing anthrax at Sverdlovsk. Fearful of further contamination and growing Western demands to inspect that facility, the Soviets had built the Stepnogorsk plant in record time and, like other secret Soviet facilities, with prison labor. Lepyoshkin and his colleagues did not try to justify what they had done. They did not say that they were only protecting their country and people from America's bioweapons programs, though several of them did not believe that the United States had actually ended its own offensive germ weapons effort. They regretted the past, they said. They had always known that what they were doing was wrong. Raising his glass, Lepyoshkin toasted the Americans and his hope that trust, friendship, and partnership would develop between them. Scientists at Stepnogorsk were desperate, he said. Iran had tried recruiting them, but they had refused such offers. Still, people could not go on like this forever, he warned. Stepnogorsk needed help. Yes, it would be a gamble, but would Washington consider helping him salvage what was left of the facility and redirect its research towards peaceful pursuits? The Americans were stunned by the contrast between the scientists' candor in this informal setting and their earlier behavior. Clearly, Weber concluded, if the desperation in Stepnogorsk was shared by scientists at Russia's own facilities, official démarches, angry protests, demands for inspections, and ritualistic visits by Americans would continue to fail. Recriminations against former Soviet scientists and military officers from the germ weapons program would remain counterproductive, but this informal Dasha diplomacy might do some good, he suspected. Weber was surprised but delighted when Lepyoshkin accepted his invitation to accompany his team to other germ sites in Kazakhstan. American U-2 planes and spy satellites had taken hundreds of pictures of Vozrozhdeniya, or Renaissance Island, the Soviet Union's largest open-air testing site. No American had ever visited the forbidding place, and Lepyoshkin knew every inch of it. In the 1960s, Lepyoshkin had spent weeks on the island testing the anthrax developed at the Stepnogorsk complex as well as agents for other diseases. Tularemia, Q fever, brucellosis, glanders, plague, and, according to Kazakh and American sources, even smallpox. Despite its isolation and inhospitable climate, temperatures routinely plunged to zero in winter and soared to 140 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Lepyoshkin had an odd affinity for the island. Between tests, he had passed the time reading, playing volleyball, drinking vodka, and painting watercolors of the island's stark, flat landscape and gray-blue sea. Some of these sketches still decorated a wall of his tiny apartment in Stepnogorsk. Perhaps it was their visit to Renaissance Island that solidified the unlikely bond between Weber and Lepyoshkin. The day after he was told that the team's fixed-wing aircraft would not be able to land on the island's dilapidated airship, Weber had plunked down $8,000 in $100 bills to rent a Soviet-era Kazakh helicopter that could make the flight. When Lepyoshkin learned that Weber had not cleared either the new plan or the expenditure with Washington, he exploded with laughter. Lepyoshkin said, patting the young American on the back, "Andy, you're a real cowboy." To Lepyoshkin, whose knowledge of America was based largely on the pirated Western movies he had watched on snowy nights with friends, a cowboy was a free spirit who continued fighting losing battles against powerful government bureaucrats. In an ideal society, the righteous cowboys would win, thought Lepyoshkin, who had always dreamed of living in such a world. Andrew Weber said, "You're the cowboy, Gennady," returning the compliment to Gennady Lepyoshkin. Lepyoshkin had also broken the rules by agreeing to accompany the Americans on their tour after having been denied official blessing. Weber would never forget the trip to Voz Island, as the American team called their destination. As their Mi-8 helicopter sped toward the island in the middle of the Aral Sea, signs of life rapidly diminished. Fishermen in their wooden boats had vanished. What had once been a living sea was now marshland. Scraggly trees gave way to patches of sagebush until, finally, there was nothing left to see but salt-covered, cement-colored sand that had once been seabed, now cracked and dry. There were no birds. Nothing seemed to live here. After the helicopter landed, Weber and his colleagues put on the white germ warfare suits, masks, and respirators that the Pentagon had given them for the mission. The suits were added insurance in case a year's worth of vaccinations against a host of gruesome diseases failed to protect them. While Cowboy Weber was willing to incur Washington's anger over the unauthorized rental of a chopper, he was taking no chances with the germs. He had first learned about Renaissance Island from intelligence reports based on Ken Alabak's debriefing. Alabak, it turned out, had brought with him one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. Vozrozhdeniya, he told the Americans, was not only the former Soviet Union's major germ testing range, it was also the world's largest burial ground of weapons-grade anthrax. For the United States, the visit was a potential intelligence gold mine. Weber recalled Ken Alabak's account of the island's sad history as he double-checked his suit, mask, and connecting air filter for holes or leaks. In the spring of 1988, scientists from Sverdlovsk had been ordered to dispose of tons of anthrax bacteria that the Soviet factory had produced and stored at Zima, near Irkutsk. Though the scientists were not told why, they had deduced that President Gorbachev was getting nervous about pressing glasnost at home and perestroika with the West. While the evidence that Moscow had blatantly violated the germ treaty was being stored throughout the country. In the new climate, the Soviet Union's anthrax stockpile was becoming a potential liability. What would Moscow do if Britain or the United States demanded an inspection and found the telltale product, a clear violation of the 1972 Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, which the Soviets had been among the first to sign and ratify? The anthrax had to be destroyed, but where and how? Anthrax spores were incredibly hardy, and Soviet science made them even more so. The scientists were ordered to dispose of the stockpile on Renaissance Island, their former test range over 1,000 miles away. Working in haste and total secrecy, they transferred the tons of bacteria, enough to destroy all the world's people many times over, into stainless steel canisters. Over the next several days, the canisters were packed into a train 24 cars long and sent on a lonely journey across the Russian and Kazakh republics to Vozrozhdeniya. At the edge of the old test range, Soviet soldiers poured bleach into the canisters to decontaminate the deadly pink powder. Then they dug huge pits and poured the sludge into the ground, burying the decontaminated spores and, Moscow hoped, a serious political threat. Now, Weber was determined to dig up anthrax and the past. As he and his team scrambled out of the helicopter, he noticed that Lepyoshkin declined the spacesuit they had offered him. If the anthrax hadn't killed him by now, Lepyoshkin joked, he was probably safe. With Lepyoshkin at their side, the Americans explored the decaying laboratory and high containment unit where Soviet scientists had handled the deadliest of agents. Though summer had just begun, the heat was a sledgehammer. Over 100 degrees, one scientist's thermometer showed. In their non-porous protective suits, the Americans sweated profusely. But the adrenaline rush of the mission, knowing that they were the first Westerners to explore the island, made them indifferent to their physical discomfort. To Weber's surprise, not only was the lab deserted, except for the occasional lizard, snake, or fly, but it also had been stripped bare. What little the Soviets had not burned or buried when they had abandoned the site in 1992, local scavengers had stolen to sell at bazaars in Nukus and faraway Tashkent. Contaminated equipment, copper pipes, and even the floor and wall tiles, some of which they had left behind, shiny lime green tiles decorated with a fish motif. The vivaria that once housed thousands of smaller animals for tests, rabbits, guinea pigs, white mice, and hamsters, as well as larger animals like horses, sheep, donkeys, monkeys, baboons, and apes, were empty, their windows smashed or missing, their roofs collapsed. In one bungalow, obviously a storage room, hundreds of small cages were stacked together. In another room stood a human-sized cage for large, non-human primates, man-sized monkeys, Lepyoshkin assured them. Back in the 1980s, Lepyoshkin had joked with Alabak, his boss at the time, about envying the doomed monkeys. The animals, at least, had been given bananas and other fruit for dinner, a luxury even for privileged Soviet germ scientists. It was gallows humor. The thousands of animals sent here had died hideous deaths, hundreds of them in a single experiment. The animals were long gone, but a stench familiar to veterans of the world of germ warfare clung to the ruins, a blend of bleach, dust, animal waste, and death. Just beyond the compound lay the vast desert test range, delineated only by telephone poles, evenly spaced a kilometer apart, to which animals had been tethered during open-air testing. Air sampling devices fastened to the poles measured the concentration and particle size of the agent and atmospheric conditions during the tests. After the American team toured the compound, scooping up surface samples from lab walls and test range soil, Weber and Lepyoshkin inspected the facility's housing compound on the northern part of the island, less than a mile from the test range. The three-story buildings that had served as barracks, homes, kindergarten, and cafeteria were deserted. But at the peak of the testing, Russian scientists, technicians, and their families had lived there, as many as 1,000 people in all. The children's playground, with its swings and a Russian's version of a jungle gym, were an eerie reminder of those who had once called this forbidding place home. Lepyoshkin told Weber that most of the children had not yet been vaccinated against the agents that, until the 1970s, had been tested there just a mile downwind: tularemia, Q fever, brucellosis glanders, typhus, VEE, that's Venezuelan equine encephalomyelitis, and plague. In some cases, no vaccines existed for the strains that had been disseminated from planes by spray tanks and from aerial cluster bombs. Lepyoshkin said, "We didn't test unless the wind was blowing south away from the living quarters." Still, there had been accidents. A plain wooden cross marked the grave of a young woman scientist who had accidentally become infected with glanders. Moscow had never disclosed her death, or those of several local fishermen who had ventured too close to the island during an ill-fated test in 1972 and were subsequently found in their drifting boat, dead from plague. Lepyoshkin, of course, had been vaccinated against many of the lethal pathogens he had tested, several strains of which were apparently unknown to Americans. Weber and his team had endured a year of painful shots to protect themselves against anthrax and other more exotic agents, but Lepyoshkin had been protected simply by stepping into a test chamber at the Stepnogorsk complex. As he listened to soothing classical music, an aerosol vaccine had wafted across his body and into his lungs. The Soviet Union had pioneered mass immunization through aerosol, jet injector, and oral vaccines, Lepyoshkin noted. In the 1960s, the Soviets had used an oral vaccine to inoculate some 6.6 million people during a 3-week period against an outbreak of smallpox, which normally kills a third of unvaccinated victims. The United States would not begin testing aerosol vaccination techniques until the late 1990s, but aerosol protection had been routine in the Soviet Union. This was yet another area in which Soviet germ scientists had excelled. The United States had much to learn from them, Weber thought, as he listened to Lepyoshkin. Lepyoshkin recalled the island was smaller and beautiful then. From the lab, you could almost touch the blue sea sparkling in the sun. Because of wrong-headed Soviet irrigation policies, the Aral Sea was shrinking. Once the world's 4th largest inland sea, it now ranked 10th. Its surface had shrunk by half between 1960 and 1990, its volume reduced by 75%. As a result, the dusty, tear-shaped speck of an island had grown from 77 to 770 square miles. At low tide on some hot summer days, it was already connected to the mainland. Soon, this once isolated island would be permanently linked to the Uzbek mainland by a natural land bridge. Then the buried anthrax germs, and who knows what else, might escape their sandy tomb. Carried by gophers and other rodents, lizards, and birds, the spores could be brought to the mainland. Since anthrax bacteria spread from animals to human beings by direct contact, the potential for widespread contamination of people whose health was already abysmal would only increase if the anthrax spores were still active. The local population already suffered from a variety of mysterious illnesses, rare forms of cancer, that may have been attributable not just to poverty and environmental degradation, but also to the region's biological and chemical legacy. Narrators note, maybe it was all the aerosolized vaccinations as well. Just throwing that one into the pot. Back to the book. No one knew for sure. There had been no census in the region since 1989, and health statistics were either non-existent or unreliable. Weber had been told of the region's plight during their stay at Aralsk, Vojvodina's island's military support headquarters, where the Soviet Army had kept a 400-man battalion of soldiers skilled in germ warfare and some 600 other troops. Before traveling to the island, the American team had spent a long night at the town's only hotel, a sweltering, bug-infested ruin, where they had talked to the former Soviet port's residents. According to Doctors Without Borders, the volunteer physicians group, people of the region, especially those in Karakalpakstan, a semi-autonomous republic in Uzbekistan that borders the sea on the southern side, were among the former Soviet Union's most chronically sick people. Some 90% of the women were anemic. Infant mortality rates were comparable to those of sub-Saharan Africa. There was an alarming increase in kidney disease and various cancers. 2/3 of the population suffered from some chronic illness, many from tuberculosis, whose incidence soared after the collapse of the Soviet Union. At Aralsk, on the Kazakh side of the sea, the local government had turned one of the deserted Soviet army barracks into a tuberculosis colony where patients could be relatively isolated. But there were no drugs for them. Aralsk's population, along with the sea that had once supported a local fishing industry, had shrunk. There were now fewer than 10,000 people. There was no work. The children on the hot, dusty streets seemed listless and pale. Even the dogs and camels looked sick. What would happen to them, Weber wondered, if the island's legacy of still deadly anthrax came ashore as the sea continued to shrink? On the Uzbek side of the island, which included most of the testing complex, an Uzbek oil company had started exploratory drilling. Some oil riggers had even set up temporary headquarters in the barracks that had once housed the Soviet germ scientists. Was the buried anthrax still alive? Could there still be other deadly remnants of Vojvodina Island's past?
When he returned to Almaty, the Kazakh capital, Weber briefed Ashton B. Carter, an assistant defense secretary who was touring the region. The two men agreed that Weber's mission had created a unique opportunity. If the Clinton administration could help Kazakhstan salvage and convert its facilities, especially the complex at Stepnogorsk, it might prevent the scientists there from returning to germ warfare work and discourage the sale of their expertise to rogue states or terrorists. It could also create a precedent. A flourishing, prosperous Stepnogorsk would be a showcase to other former Soviet republics and even to Russia, which strongly resisted biological cooperation with the West. America, Weber urged Carter, had to make Stepnogorsk a poster child for the benefits of transparency, international cooperation, and non-proliferation.
So the book does many things out of order here. Chapter 4 in the Amazon Audible audiobook, Chapter 4 at 2502, represents this last paragraph of Chapter 7 in the book on page 270. So for whatever reason, a large portion of Chapter 7 was omitted from the Germs book. I'm not really sure why. Perhaps it was because it got too far into the details of how Andrew Weber was touring the particular facility. Now, some background information on Andrew Weber. This is Andrew Weber, born 1960, so that would make him, does that mean he's 65 right now? That's incredible. That's how long we've been messing around at this stuff, everybody. He was a kid when he started. He's 65 right now. Some of the associations that he's had, which are among many. He was working on a movie called Gain of Function with Jamie Metzl. We know that I have at least 2 presentations. One from 2013, where Andrew Weber was co-presenting with Peter Daszak. So Peter Daszak's presentation peer is also a key person in the Germs book 2001. As a matter of fact, later on in the book, the person Tom Monath will actually be discussed. And Tom Monath is also a extensive collaborator of Dr. Peter Daszak. Other things which are covered in the book later on, by the way, include the West Nile virus outbreak, which also involves, at least as far as newspapers go, multiple quotes from Peter Daszak, and this is from 1999 and 2000. So Peter Daszak, again, among the most visible names in the COVID-19 story, is right behind the scenes there, all the way back with many of the people that were involved in, at least in books, involved the possibility of a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center that were released on September 7th or 9th of the year 2001. Also noteworthy that Peter Daszak is really someone who focused on the gut and was co-authoring key papers on measles viruses with none other than Andrew Wakefield, at least 2 of them, in 1997, 1998 in the UK. I have some other videos on Andrew Weber. I may introduce them later on. I don't know. He is among the early team of people that founded the organization, the DTRA, within the military, Defense Threat Reduction Agency. I know that his wife, or first wife, last name was Kwanrud, I believe, was an executive secretary for United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Or maybe it was when she was a United States senator. Noteworthy that she was a U.S. senator in the state of New York on the day of September 11th, 2001. But there's much more I can add. So that's it for episode 280.7, which corresponds to, again, chapter 7 of the book. Only a little bit of the content is included in the audiobook, and it ranges from approximately minute 20 to minute 25:02 of chapter 4 in the Amazon Audible audiobook. So thank you very much, everyone. Look out for episode 280.8, which will be the next chapter breakthrough, starting on page 271. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the supporters. Houstonic.live. Any support is appreciated to cover the multiple expenses of the computers, of the research accounts, of the backup devices, and so on. You can find information on how to support the channel at Houstonic.live. Just go to Houstonic.live. It's the URL. And Patreon, PayPal, and we have a P.O. box where if you just happen to have a sample, I guess, of that anthrax powder from Russia, you could send that here as well if you feel so compelled. No, I'm actually joking, but I'm sure some people would like to do that. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Take care. God bless.